Hi, I'm Andy with San Juan Soil and Water Conservation District. This backyard conservation workshop will be looking at pollinators, particularly different types of pollinators, pollinator plants, pollinator insects of New Mexico, attracting pollinators, and building homes for pollinators. Our first part is different types of pollinators. Now, when we look at different types of pollinators, we also have to look at the different types of flowers, because different flowers bloom at different times of the years, have different structures and colors, which attract different pollinators. So on the left-hand side of this image, and this image was created by the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority in Los Angeles, California. And on the left half, we can see that there are different cues that tell flowers when it's time to bloom, primarily light, water, and temperature. In the spring, summer, or fall, whenever that plant blooms, it understands that when there's different amounts of light or a change in the amount of light, that triggers it to start producing flowers. Or when there are different changes to the amount of water it's receiving, that can also trigger it to flower, which particularly plants, when they're flowering, do need much more water than when they're not flowering. Also, temperature can trigger the plants to produce flowers. So, plants have a few different types of attributes that will attract different pollinators, from color to scent, shape, timing of when they bloom, and other things as well. So on this diagram, we can see several different types of pollinators: birds, bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, but there are more as well, such as bats or other animals. So on these different types of flowers, you can see that if you're wanting to attract birds, you would want to have a flower that produces long, tubular red or orange flowers in particular. You're likely going to be getting hummingbirds. Also, you can see that while bees pollinate lots of different colors, from yellows and oranges, blues and whites and purples, they're not necessarily going to pollinate everything. So if you're trying to attract a specific type of pollinator, consider what type of flower it produces. Now, while these flowers in this diagram are specific to California, and the ones we have out here are a bit different in New Mexico, we still have the same concepts, that the different insects or creatures as pollinators will be pollinating plants that they prefer. Just like how humans have preferred foods or diets, so do insects and pollinators. So part 2, pollinator plants. So you don't have to read this, but this is just to give credit to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, who is also funding these backyard conservation workshops through a grant. And this is something that they put together along with NMSU, New Mexico State University, and it's a list of pollinator plants specifically for New Mexico. Now, there's a lot of stuff here. It's very detailed, and it provides a lot of really good information. All of this is available on our website at sanjuanswcd.com. All of our materials are available there in full. And you can see that it's giving the scientific name, common name, whether the seeds are commercially available, when the blooming season is, how easy it is to propagate in a greenhouse, and different propagation protocols, which it gives more details about. It talks about whether it self-seeds and it will keep reproducing, and it also has notes. Some of the notes, so this is the recommended native annuals. Here we get into recommended native perennials. You'll see over in the notes it'll recommend whether it's adapted for dry or cold, and then also some of them, as we get further down the list, we'll also recommend whether they grow large or they're hardy, and also if they're weedy. If you notice, the verbena up at the very top does have a possible note that it could be invasive. So be aware of that if you're choosing to plant that as a recommended native perennial for attracting pollinators. It also gives full details on shrubs and trees, and a lot of detail. Also, it has introduced annuals, biennials, perennials, and shrubs that are all commercially available as seed. Notice that these are not native, they are introduced, and a couple of them can be weedy, as it says over on the right. but some of them could work really well in your backyard for attracting pollinators. If you obtained the pollinator seed mix, that was the free resource through this backyard conservation workshop, you'll see that it has a pretty good selection of 10 different pollinator wildflowers and shrubs to attract pollinators to your yard. And it's got full details. If you didn't get this, feel free to email me or contact me for details on how to properly plant and use and care for your pollinators. Part 3, Pollinator Insects of New Mexico. Now, this material was put together by NMSU's Cooperative Extension Service, and this is just put out in May of 2019. It's extremely helpful. It goes into a lot of detail about the different beneficial insects in our backyard in New Mexico. Now, I am including the table of contents to show you that it doesn't just talk about pollinators, which we are going to talk about here. It also covers natural enemies of pest insects. So these are insects that you would want in your backyard to get rid of other, insects or, pests that you would not want in your backyard. Particularly aphids is usually a popular one, or squash bugs. So these are insects that you can introduce to your backyard. You typically get them especially like ladybugs or lady beetles. You can get those at your local garden store or nursery. You release them into your backyard and they will feast on the aphids that are harming your plants. But we're going to mostly talk about the pollinators. Along with this guide that also is available on our website in full, it talks about how to identify insects and different parts of insects. And this way, when you see an insect in your yard, you can identify whether it's a beneficial insect or a pest insect, because there's so many, hundreds of different types of insects that you'll find just in your backyard that can be really tricky to know, okay, which ones are good, which ones are bad, and how do I tell the difference? So this talks about different parts of an animal or parts of the insect and how to identify the different parts. Now, for pollinators, the first one is the bumblebee, of course, and it gives instructions on how to identify it based on the head, the body, wings, when it's active, when you'll see it, or other, things that it generally visits wide variety of flowers as opposed to just a couple types of flowers. But yeah, bumblebees are one of the excellent pollinators that we do have around here. Here you can see one on a coneflower in the bottom left. And another type of pollinator that we often talk about is our honeybees. Now, while these are not native, they are excellent for pollinating our crops. And here's some identification tips so you can figure out what you're looking at when you're looking at something you suspect might be a honeybee. A couple things to note: that they're generally active in the early spring to very late fall, so they're generally active pretty much all of the blooming season, and they also visit a wide variety of flowers. Now, after we look at honeybees, there's some other bees that, here's honeybees again. There's some other bees that you may not have heard of, and if you saw them, you might think that they were actually a pest. This here is the metallic green sweat bee, and they typically are active from spring to fall, and they are generalists, also going for a wide variety of flowers, but they look very different than your typical bumblebee or honeybee, yet they are still beneficial in your yard and are great pollinators for our area. And then they also talk about different sizes of bees, and that becomes really important when we start talking about specifically attracting these pollinators to our backyards and our homes, and how to build homes for them to be able to nest over winter and that kind of stuff, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So these small bees are pretty small. They range from 2 millimeters to 10 millimeters in length, and keep in mind 2 millimeters is tiny, and that's their full length. And these bees can include 3 different families, and there's many different bees within each family, and they are also generally pretty wide for the variety of flowers that they will pollinate. And there are a few specialists, as it says, in some of those families or genuses down into the other category. So the small bees, while we might not really think of them as a big pollinator group, are very important for pollinating a lot of different flowers, especially our native flowers here in New Mexico. Here's just a variety of different types of what they consider small bees. Now, medium and large bees, again, you typically think of the honeybee and the bumblebee, but these are others that are, still bees and still beneficial pollinators, but different and might look different. And you might not be able to identify what they are just, off the top of your head. But these, again, will be pollinating from early spring to fall, depending on the species. And a lot of these large bees are not going to be attracted to the really, really tiny flowers because they are larger. So they're typically going to visit the disc and tubular shaped flowers. Here's some of the different types of the larger, medium, and larger bees. Here's a few more. And a couple more. Now, remember that bees are not the only pollinators, and especially, that today is Earth Day. Happy 50th anniversary Earth Day. And we often talk about bees as being, the most important pollinators, but they're not the only pollinators, as we mentioned at the beginning of this episode. So, obviously, monarch butterflies are an excellent pollinator and very important. And if you're wanting to attract monarch butterflies, then you're specifically going to want to be planting milkweed, because when they're reproducing, their caterpillars require milkweed as they are a specialist and they need it to survive. There's also a couple other butterflies that look like monarchs that you might see, and often they only feed on milkweed plants. So here you can see both the monarch and the queen butterfly, and both of them are specialists where their larvae will only eat milkweed. So please plant milkweed in your yard. So how do we actually attract the pollinators to our yard? Well, with the butterflies we just talked about, planting milkweed, or when you're planting specific flowers, plant flowers that will attract a specific type of pollinator. But also, this here is the Backyard Conservation Resource from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the, of course, USDA organization that is, or department that is funding this program. And here we can see in the how to attract pollinators to your backyard, it has primarily what to do, or primarily regarding what you plant. So what you plant will attract specific things. So here it gives a good list of shrubs for birds, trees for birds and other wildlife, vines for birds, flowers for birds, nectar plants for hummingbirds. It gives a long list of a lot of different things. So really, one of the best things for being able to attract pollinators to your yard and attracting wildlife to your yard is, of course, planting plants that will be able to feed them and provide home for them as well. Also here it talks about you can build a bird house for them to nest in and use for reproducing. And here it also talks about butterfly plants, or plants that will attract butterflies. Here you can see down under the plants for caterpillars. So you might think that when you're attracting butterflies, you just need to plant the flowering plants for the butterflies, but you also need to provide food for their larval stage, or the caterpillars. So those plants down there, particularly butterfly weed and other milkweeds, are very important for the butterflies. Now, you can also plant nectar plants for bees and build bee houses. And let's take a look at some of the more detailed homes that you could build, or simple and detailed homes you could build for attracting bees. One more. Also talks about how if you are able to supply water, such as a little bird bath or water bath, or have a small water feature. Now granted, we do want to use smart water features here in New Mexico because we have so little water and it is so dry, which we do have in other backyard conservation workshops specifically on smart water features. But if you do have a water feature, just a small place for birds to be able to access water and take a bath, it will also attract more wildlife and also help, hopefully if you can get the hummingbirds there and other pollinator birds, attract more pollinators as well. So how do we build homes for our pollinators? So this here is put out by the Michigan State University Extension Office, similar to our own local NMSU Extension Office. And this is an excellent guide to building and managing bee hotels for wild bees. And whether or not this is in Michigan, East Coast, West Coast, Southwest, New Mexico, it's still the same principle because as you saw when we looked at the specific pollinator insects of New Mexico, we have small bees, we have large bees, we have leafcutter bees, we have masonry bees or masoner bees, and they're all going to need those different types of homes that we're going to talk about here. So this resource is also available on our website, sanjuanswcd.com, along with Michigan State University's Extension Office website. So when you're building homes for bees, there's a lot of different ways that you can build them and design them, and really it's just finding what works best for you. So to understand the cycle of the nest tunneling bees, which will be using most of the stuff that we would be making, in the spring they're going to be reproducing, then they're going to be filling the homes with larvae and enough pollen to be able to feed those larvae for when they hatch. They'll then seal them off. And then in the fall and winter, those larvae will develop and pupate, and in the spring they emerge and reproduce and continue the cycle. So we need to be able to make homes that are the correct size for the type of bee that we're looking at. So notice over on the left, in the top left picture, you see a lot of those little holes in the wood that have been drilled on the bottom, and the tubes on the top have already been filled. Well, that's because the bees are already using that hotel as a home for overwintering. Also in the middle section, you see somebody just took a stump, drilled holes in it, and the bees use that to overwinter and keep alive in the winter and be able to reproduce year-round. Also in the bottom pictures, you see all of those tubes have been filled up with mud, and those are mason hotels hotels for mason bees that are using mud to block in the ends and protect their young. So you could build bee hotels out of bamboo or reeds or paper tubes, cardboard, straws. A lot of different materials can be used to make these bee homes. Also, if you're going to be drilling holes, you don't want to just drill one size of hole because, as that picture shows on the right, you need lots of different sizes of holes for lots of different sizes of bees. So you're going to be going from as small as possible of a hole that you can drill up to about 3/4 of an inch. 3/8 of an inch. About 3/8 of an inch is about the largest you need, and you can go all the way down to 3/32 or about 1/16, which is usually about the smallest drill bit in a standard set of drill bits. So using that, you can just keep going up in size and drill just a bunch of different size holes in different pieces of wood. Now, keeping it in a location that is also safe is important because if you just put it out in the open where it's uncovered, then it'll get wet and then the larvae will rot and it will not be a good home for them. Also, if it's in a place where woodpeckers are able to get to it or other pests are able to get to it, they'll find it as basically a all-you-can-eat buffet until the larvae are all in the overwintering bees are all eaten up. Also keep in mind that you shouldn't be using any pesticides or various cleaners around the bee hotels, as they are sensitive to it. But there on the right you can see some steps for maintenance and monitoring. You can use bleach because it evaporates or gases off very quickly if you need to clean stuff. Now you do need to actually monitor or clean and take care of your bee hotel over time. Because once they've used it and those babies have emerged or the adults have come out after wintering over, they typically don't use the same nest again. So you need to be able to clean out the holes or tubes and reset it for the next season. A few different ways you can do that. This person in the top left has decided that for their mason bee nest, they would roll up paper inside each and one of their bamboo tubes or their wooden tubes. So then in the summer, after all the bees have come out, they pull out the paper, discard the paper and the materials left behind by the bees, put new paper in, and then they have a new bee hotel ready to go. Another option would be in the summer, if you're using a stack of wood that you maybe cut down and are drying for firewood, as you're letting it basically sit for a year to age and dry out, after it's cut down that first summer or fall, drill a bunch of holes into it, stack it up, protect it and cover it. Let the bees use it for nesting. Then the next summer, once it has already dried all winter and sat all winter, move it to a more protected area where you would then be able to use it for firewood and the bees wouldn't necessarily be using it for nesting. So you could then rotate through wood each year that you're using for firewood without actually burning the larvae inside the wood in the winter. So that's one possible option. You're going to want to basically watch for different predators that are potentially getting into the bees and potentially eating some of the bees. Finally, here's a few different examples of the mason bees and the leafcutter bees. And the tunnel nesting species as well. It talks a little bit about them. We do have all of these types of bees here in New Mexico, so this still applies to us. And if you want to, here's the acknowledgments for their extension document they put together. And if you want to take a look at some other bee hotels that have been built, here's some samples. Really simple stuff up in the top left, just some holes drilled in wood, mounted underneath an overhang on a roof or a building to protect it from the rain, keep it dry. Great bee hotel. There you can see in the bottom right with all the purple flowers, just lots of bamboo or reed cuttings stacked into a box with a piece of wood over top of it to protect it from rain. Over on the top right, you can see basically firewood and other pieces of wood just with holes drilled in them. Really simple, easy way to build a bee hotel. Middle one, a little bit more detailed, different sizes of holes, different kinds of wood, that kind of stuff. But really, if you're going to build a home for bees, I think the phrase would be go big or go home. So hopefully that gives you some ideas for how to build a bee hotel and some fun ideas for attracting pollinators to your backyard. All of our materials for the Backyard Conservation Workshops all are available on our website, sanjuanswcd.com. And thank you to the Natural Resource Conservation Service and USDA for the funding for these programs to be able to offer these backyard conservation workshops. Thank you for joining, and hope you join us for our next video.